Our objective is to ensure that USDO is always traded at USDO at $1 on the market. Now USDO is over collateralized, you know that. So it always locks $1 worth of value on the Omnicomp minter. And there is an excess amount for security, which means that in the event that this collateral becomes less in value because it's dynamic in value, USDO is still able to have this much buffer, and it always still locks $1 worth of value, and there is always this much buffer over here. Now the peg is a function of the native demand for USDO and liquidity. Now native demand basically means other places and people who are willing to accept USDO at $1. Now the reality is, if somebody accepts USDO for $1, they need to pay for their own expenses, they need to pay their own suppliers, their own salaries, etc., etc. So even if they accept USDO, unless USDO is accepted by their suppliers and their upstream cost centers, they are going to need to sell USDO for the stable, which is always going to create a downward pressure on the price of USDO. So if you think of the whole system where the LP is like a bucket of water, the supply, this is the supply of USDO coming into it, and this is the outflow of USDO from the system. If more people are putting in USDO than the people taking out USDO from the system, then the level of water is going to rise. So if this was our expected scenario where it is in balance at the peg, if more people are selling USDO, then effectively the water level will rise and the peg will be lost and it will trade at less than $1 of value. Now basically what we want to do is we want to ensure that there's a balance between the people minting or selling and the people who are buying, and that is done at the LP level. But what we should remember is not all liquidity is equal. Okay, so on Uniswap and PCS or PancakeSwap, you have their selling curve is basically a parabola. It is essentially x into y equal to k, and the price is essentially a tangent to this curve. But the price which we want, which is where it is equal, is only a very small portion, because otherwise in other portions of the curve it differentiates, it changes significantly from where we want, which means that Uniswap and PancakeSwap or any swap which has x into y equal to k is going to have very high slippage. Whereas on something like a curve, they have essentially a very large portion of their swap bonding curve where it is essentially flat, and that leads to very high capital efficiency and low slippage, which means with the same amount of liquidity you can have far lower slippage and very high capital efficiency. What that means for liquidity providers is more trading fees, and for the people who are going to trade, it means low slippage. And for USDO, what it means is USDO will be able to stay at the peg with lower liquidity amounts. So for example, there is about $75,000 worth of liquidity in the USDO BUSD pool, and the peg is lost very easily when somebody trades. In an AMM which has this kind of bonding curve, the slippage would be very low. I mean, it can still slip if it goes into this extreme territory, but for a very high portion, very significant portion of the bonding curve, the peg would still be working as expected. So even with the same amount, being on something like this is far more efficient and effective than being on Uniswap or PancakeSwap. So the issue with Curve, or it's not an issue, it's really a feature, is it only allows trading with similar pairs, similar asset pairs. So it allows you USD, T, BUSD, DAI, etc. Or it can allow you WBTC, RENBTC, SBTC, etc., which are all inherently equal. Now, they do have, to be fair, new implementations, which is Curve v2 and Uniswap v3, which are modified versions of their implementations, which allow dissimilar assets. They also allow high capital efficiency and low slippage. But that is not the scope of this video. But we'll briefly touch upon them. So in Uniswap v3, we have mini AMMs and their LPs are NFTs, and they require very active management of on the part of the liquidity providers. It's quite complex, to be fair, and it requires a complete dedicated video by itself. But the complexity is a turn off, and it sort of loses a lot of users in that process. Now, Curve v2 also allows dissimilar assets. It concentrates liquidity at current price, and it is again a very complex implementation. If you look at the white paper for that one, it's full of mathematical formulas. Probably need a maths PhD to actually understand it. Fairly complicated, and we believe that there is a simpler way. Now, the reality is the price is a function of the slope of your bonding curve. So if you look at this, this is the slope of the bonding curve, and let's say this is X and this is Y. This is how much X you'll get for this much Y. This is how much X you'll get for this much Y. This is how much Y you'll get for this much X. So that is what, depending upon where you are on the bonding curve, that's how the price moves. And if this is flat, then effectively means for this entire region, you will get the same amount of X as same amount of Y. Now, to allow dissimilar assets, what we really need to do is we need to change the slope based on price reference. So for example, this is where X equals Y. This is the same as this. Now, if you want X less than Y, you want, as in like for the same amount of Y, if you want more X, sorry, if you, this is the amount of Y you get for this much X, which means you have to provide more X for the same amount of Y. Then effectively this is the portion where it is flat, and then again it curves over here and it kind of curves over here. So this angle effectively determines the slope. This ratio between this and this is what determines the slope. Over here, this is the slope. And over here, this is the angle of the slope. And if you want more X for less Y, then you'll have to supply more Y to gain X. In that case, this is the angle. So by just changing the slope of this line or this portion of the curve, you can effectively support dissimilar asset prices. So it doesn't have to be similar assets. Now, Curve's original white paper actually references this in the first few paragraphs itself. So it's not a new idea, it's an existing concept. But they do mention that for that, you need that the price is fed in via Oracle. So that is the limitation of this system. You do need a price source for this kind of a system, but it's an acceptable compromise to achieve high capital efficiency and low slippage. Now, what we can do is, if we build such a system, in case of USDO, we can always set USDO at $1 in such a system, which means it becomes a solution where USDO is always treated as $1, and USDO is the base, going to be the base pair of such a system. So if you want to add any asset to this AMM, it has to be paired against USDO, which means if you want to go from token A to token B, you'll first have to go from token A to USDO and to token B, which means that that could be D, E, F, any number of tokens which can be added, and you can always create any LP. You can go from, let's say, D to E, but it always goes through USDO. You can go from B to F, you can go from B to C, you can go from A to B, you can go from D to A, but it always goes from via USDO, which means that if it effectively drives native demand for USDO, and it always treats USDO at $1. So it effectively creates demand and liquidity for USDO, which are the two main objectives which we have in order to ensure the peg. Now, why would anybody actually use this AMM? Why would anybody add liquidity to this AMM? The answer is simple. As discussed previously, such an AMM would have very high capital efficiency, which means that it is typically going to be at least 40 times more efficient than Uniswap V2. Let's be accurate over here. Then in terms of what the outcomes are for LPs. And for traders, it's going to be very low slippage. It's also going to be significantly simpler than both Curve V2 and Uniswap V3. The LPs are ERC20 or BP20, which means they are composable, unlike Uniswap V3 LPs, which are NFTs. And it would effectively mean that LPs who supply liquidity to this AMM would get significantly more fees, and it would provide significantly lower slippage for traders. So this is a clear USP for this kind of an AMM, and it also serves the purpose of ensuring that USDO peg is maintained by building native demand and liquidity for USDO. So we are going to provide incentives for early adopting partner teams. Partner incentives will be used to incentivize USDO BUSD LP, which means that again should boost the liquidity for USDO. And this can be other stables as well, DAI, USDC, etc. So this allows us to create a lower slippage AMM pair for USDO and also create native demand at $1. And that will help us achieve our objective of ensuring that USDO stays at peg.